Common Good Podcast. It's a Wednesday, January 19th. And on Wednesdays, we talk to faith leaders and we talk to people of faith who are motivated to do something of good for the world. We like to call the common good. Today, I'm so glad to be talking with Ani Zonneveld, from the founder and president of Muslims for Progressive Values. Ani is, you've been on this conversation before on the podcast and the live stream. And I'm a big fan of your work. So thank you so much for being with us today. There's so much going on in the world. We're going to talk about, what the common good looks like in the United States and how our faith drives us here. But as we were just talking, you're also somebody who works at the international level. And I'd love for you to talk about the meeting you were just in and the work you were doing in November over in Cape Town and in Kenya, and what faith means around the world and what the common good means around the world and how we're sent into it, motivated by it. But right now, I'll just acknowledge it's 8 a.m. where you are on the West Coast in California. So thanks for being up so bright and early. But then thinking you were just in another meeting before that. So you've had a full work day already. So Ani, thanks for being with us.
Sure, absolutely happy to be here as always, Doug.
When I think about Muslims for Progressive Values, it is such a powerful group, and it really concerns itself with human rights, with women's rights, and with all people's rights. And it's really a standout organization. Can you talk a little bit about why you started it, what its history has been, and what you're doing with it now?
It started out just wanting to have a community around me of like-minded Muslims. I was born in Malaysia and raised Muslim, and the kind of Islam I was raised on and the kind of Islam that is sort of mainstream or mainline now is very different. So being in the United States, after 9/11, particularly, the environment was very toxic, and also the prejudices against Muslim is one aspect of it, but also within the Muslim community, there's a lot of misogynistic interpretations of Islam and homophobic, and just a very contrary to my upbringing, the version of Islam that I was raised on, and that was very inclusive and very loving and compassionate kind of Islam. And also the notion of music being forbidden, particularly the women's voice, having the mandate supposedly that we need to cover our hair, etc. So these are new contradictions of Islam compared to how I was raised. So just wanting a community for myself of like-minded Muslims, that's basically the at the heart of it, and a community that really that was a safe space for you to express your critical thinking, whether it be theologically or whether it be in a musical form, etc. And so that was essentially a space of freedom of expression and freedom of religion and belief. And fortunately, there were a lot of other American Muslims who also have shared the same sentiment and same set of values. And so we came together in 2007 in New York and formed Muslims for Progressive Values, where I was voted as a president or executive director, charged with registering the organization and running it with zero budget. And so
right. We hereby elect you to do all of the complicated work to run an organization.
Go ahead and do it. We know you. If anyone's going to do it, it's you, Ani. I says, yeah, good call, guys. So here we are.
Before that, you had been or are, I guess, is it a Grammy nominated musician? Is that right?
Yes. So I have a Grammy certification for a songwriting project with a contemporary blues artist, Keb Mo. And one was a nomination and one was a winning certificate. And so I still, it's been some years since I wrote some songs, but I still write songs, but more in a spiritual genre. So we don't have, for example, an Islamic or spiritual music in English worship songs, for example. So as an American Muslim, what's really missing as Western Muslims in general is we actually don't have our own American Muslim culture, because what we have is brought in from wherever we come from. And a lot of that is also foreign. And so for our children, that foreignness doesn't resonate for them. And so what I've been doing in the last 15 years or so is also to create a collection of body of work that is worship songs, spiritual songs in English for American Muslims or Muslims in the West. And so this year we're going to take it up to the next level. We're going to produce a theater piece for us, a musical theater piece. So all these traditionalists who say that is all taboo, well,
Wow.
Yeah, we're not heeding that warning. Let's put it that way.
A lot of people might not know that Islam is particular not only in sort of different traditions, but regionally. So what is it about the Malaysian experience that you had when you were growing up that was different? And why did that Malaysian experience and version of Islam not be the one exported to the United States? You sort of think about the United States as a progressive, liberal kind of place. You're living out in LA. Like, why is it that the more conservative expressions of Islam are the ones that are more common for people's experience here?
Yeah. The Muslim world has changed tremendously in the last 25 years, and that has a lot to do with Saudi money, petrodollars. And so even Malaysia today is not the same Malaysia or the environment that I was raised in. So even in Malaysia, the practice of Islam there is very Wahhabi, and they have moral police, and so it's just regressed in the way Muslims themselves practice Islam there. And as to why isn't the more egalitarian and inclusive interpretation of Islam being the one imported into the Western world, and particularly here in the United States, has a lot to do with also money, and has a lot to do with immigrants. When they come, they tend to want to cling to their own particular nationality and culture. And so what happened was, the mosque in the United States used to not have barriers between men and women. So it would be one open space, and men one side and women the other side, or men up front more traditionally and women in the back rows, but it would be in one open space. And that's not. And over the years, what has happened is, with the influence of Saudi money and Wahhabism, whatever, their petitions and barriers started to come up between the men and the women spaces. And then now it's regressed even further, where women actually have a really secondary space, like in the basement or by the kitchen, dingy spaces, and women have to enter through the back door even. So, that used to not be the case. So we were much more progressive 25 years ago compared to how many of the mosques are here in the United States. So
that's amazing.
That's the problem. It's money, and it's what are the books that are being sold in the bookstores in the mosque, and what is the theology that they're teaching is very much influenced by the orthodoxy and the money within that orthodoxy.
It's interesting because I talked to obviously Jewish leaders and so many Christian leaders, and a lot of us in these three traditions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, are still perplexed as to why the more conservative expressions of religion are more dominant in the United States. It's a real dilemma. It's almost as if religion wants to serve a conservative function in society. And I don't mean that only on a theological boundary, but it seems like when the people who desire their religious expression are also wanting something that feels more conservationist and more conservative and more rooted in some previous time or place or expression. So I think it's just such an interesting, the details and the particularities are different in every tradition, of course, but there's something that seems shared.
So the institutions are very conservative.
That's right.
In the Muslim context, if you look at the Pew research that they concluded that they were doing post 9/11, they did three research studies on American Muslims. It was in 2007, 2013, and the last one was 2017. And it was clear how American Muslim attitudes towards various issues became very progressive over the years. So in 2017, the conclusion is 69% of American Muslim men do not attend mosque and find spiritual inspiration outside the mosque.
Wow.
71% of American Muslim women share the same view.
Okay.
So this goes to show that it's the institutions that are conservative, but it is not appealing to the American Muslims at large.
Yeah, and
So
your work,
they're dinosaurs essentially, right? Because particularly Muslim women, we've left mosque a long time ago.
Yep.
And what is really mind-boggling to me is if the mosques would change their attitude and have more egalitarian space and more egalitarian theology, which is rooted in Islam, by the way, you would have to turn people away. Right? So, because we all want that spiritual connection, we all want that community,
right,
but we want it in a way that is inclusive of all of God's creations, not a particular dressing, a particular race, a particular what have you, right? So,
well, I'm sure
this
you're
is the
getting a lot of
frustration.
amens from people from the other traditions that feel the same way,
And
like it's a shared experience, isn't
yeah.
it?
And just imagine if the mosque would, for example, borrow some of the business model of the churches. So you have church services that are in Spanish and then they're in English, and and they have these musical activities for children and for adults, and all these kind of
Mm-hmm.
programmings that really
Mm-hmm.
bring all kinds of people together in the space. That would be so beautiful, but they're not interested in that. They're interested in their own this very
Yeah.
discriminating interpretation of Islam, and I don't know. I don't know how that fulfills them spiritually. I don't understand that, but
Mm-hmm.
go figure.
And so, like a lot of traditions, you're having to find ways to connect people into their faith and into action and life that doesn't utilize the system of congregations. And I'll just note, because I've talked about this, and I love your thoughts on this. Sometimes when an ecumenical event is brought together, something where there's going to be people from varied traditions, organizers often don't know how to connect with people who are not in an organized religious congregation. So they tend to go to those places because there's an identifiable person that runs that
And
mosque or
men.
that synagogue, and they're almost always men. And so these other groups like you run and the stuff that we do, you end up often, because you're not organized in the same way to be invited into the more ecumenical participations. There's less representation of what might actually be the larger audience of people who are interested in your kind of
Yeah,
faith.
and the thing about it too is in a lot of these interfaith organizational structures, they are still very traditional in that they are institutions, mosques, churches, synagogues, Buddhist temples, etc., etc. And whoever that leadership is, and whoever the leadership or an appointed leadership, a representative or a spokesperson is, right? So you may get a bit of diversity there, but in the Muslim community traditional context, it's usually a male representative because it's the imam of the mosque. I have personally experienced this where an interfaith community wanted me to do the call for prayer to break the fast, or to break the fast at a Thanksgiving dinner at one time many years ago. And the traditional members of that interfaith organizations basically said to the organizers, if you invite her to do the call for prayer, we will tell our community, we will boycott this dinner. We will not participate in it. And so then I was disinvited. So there's that bullying that happens behind the
Mm-hmm.
scenes as well. And I think also the issue that I have with a lot of interfaith organizations is that they tend to be obviously more of the progressive arm of a particular religious tradition,
Mhm.
or a faith tradition that
That's right.
wants to be more inclusive of other traditions, right? So, and a lot of times, you have these interfaith communities and organizations, but they do not share the same values. So, for example, an Episcopalian church have very liberal views about women's place in society, LGBT, etc., abortion rights, etc., but they do not coincide well with, say, other faith traditions, and particularly in my context, the Muslim faith tradition, or traditional ones. So I think the progressive non-Muslim institutions that do want to of who you're in bed with.
Hmm. Yeah. All right. So that's the context you're in, and Muslims for progressive values had to it was created to respond to that and a lot of other conditions in the world. And you care about human rights and you care about social justice, things that are, I think, beautiful synonyms for the common good. And what is it for you in your faith that really motivates you to this public common good work? Because you choose at great effort and cost and sacrifice to be public about the common good work you do in the context of your faith. What is it that propels you to do this?
Yeah, I it's that fire in the belly, and it's so hard to explain. I think you just know it when you know it, and I'm blessed. I feel very blessed for it. I am doing this work. I'm really driven, and it's an internal thing. It's a drive that I can't turn off, and it's a calling that uh, I can't turn off, even if I tried. And as a matter, I'll tell you a story. So I'm so driven to the point where I'm exhausted. Right, my work starts very early in the day, and I have a few hours break in the afternoon because everyone else is asleep in the world during that specific few hours, and then I work out and make dinner, and then I start work again, for several more hours into the evening, because that's when different parts of the world everyone's waking up and responding to messages and planning, etc. So so I'm working myself into exhaustion, and I go to bed and I say, okay, dear God, please turn that fire in my belly down, and I go to sleep. And the next day I wake up, the fire is even more furious, right? So I've learned not to ask
Pray that prayer.
for that to be tempered with. So I the Quran for me is, there's some sacred texts in there. There are some verses in the Quran that really propels me to do this work in a way that is uncompromising, and I am uncompromising in my positions, in the human rights positions that I take. You can't pick and choose whose human rights you're defending. All of God's creations, whether it be human beings, animal, the universe, we
Mhm.
are all God's creations. And so I come from this very universal interpretation of Islam, of the loving and compassionate God. And, just about every verse in the Quran except for one opens up with this Arabic Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which is in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, right? And
Mhm.
the Quran is always talking about how we need to be God conscious, and how we need to elevate ourselves to become more godly in our mannerism, and how we care for each other, ourselves, our own body, and the our humankind, and all of God's creations. And yet, in Muslim societies, there is this disregard for health, for the environment, for animals, and for other human beings. Um, and so it's a contradiction of the
Mhm.
essence of the teachings of the Quran. And so I just feel that when your heart is open, when your eyes are open and your heart is open, it's really difficult to turn away or to turn the other cheek and to walk away from that. It's hard for me to do that. So
Yeah.
so I go in it, with a gusto, and thank goodness and thank God that over these 15 years, there are more and more Muslims that have taken the work that we've done, the framing of the work that we've done, as that is, whether it be that is Islam in the context of human rights. How do you use the language of Islam in affirming human rights, not to discriminate, um, and not to oppress, because that's what governments do. And what is really rewarding for me is to see, so many partners popping up all over the world, um, borrowing the language that we've been using and partnering with us, and how to mainstream that language in
Wow.
their societies. And I'm talking about religious authorities, even, male religious leaders actually, buying into this language and say, yeah, of course, Islam supports women's rights, and this is how we can do it. And the way you framed it, the counter narrative to misogyny, we totally buy into it. And how do we work together, and so on and so forth. So that's the most rewarding. Me sitting here in LA and doing this work, and how that resonates globally, is, I cannot tell you how rewarding this is. Yeah.
Well, you really do have this global perspective. And I wonder if some of that comes from the location of Islam in the United States, that it's a minority faith here as opposed to a majority faith, and that so many of the expressions of Islam root themselves elsewhere in the world. Is that part of what helps you navigate and think about global issues? Or do you have other motivations for how and why you're engaged, with the UN and with
Yeah.
other
So
nations around?
there's two things to that. One, being in the United States, we have the constitutional right to interpret religion the way you want and to practice it without punishment, and that in itself is a protection around Muslims such as myself. Now, if I was going to do the same in Malaysia, I would be in jail already, and I was close to being in jail already. So. um, and so you have to be very careful when you do this work in Muslim majority societies, and where the state of a country defines what it is to be a Muslim and what Islam is. And if you deviate from that, you're thrown in jail, or yeah, there's a whole process. But anyway, so that's number one. Number two, my upbringing is, my dad was a diplomat, so I grew all over the
Oh,
world, and so I have a very my worldview is therefore very open
hmm.
and very inclusive in nature. And that also has to do with the way my parents raised me too. I've never heard any discriminating remarks from them, of anyone, of any religion, of any race, what have you. So I was raised to be open and loving and inclusive. This is who I am. And so, America has its own very specific issues, and the Muslim world has very specific set of issues. And for me, it's easy to connect the local issues, what we're experiencing here in the United States, with what's happening on issues of gender, women's issues in the context of Islam in Muslim societies. So the one thing that I've noticed for many years now, and I've written on it, is the creep-in Christian Sharia law, I call it. And then I've written about it because I recognize it, miles away, coming at us, because it is what has happened in Muslim societies, and how they legislate based on religious laws, their understanding of Islam, right? So it's called Sharia law. And so here in the United States, for many years, in many states, you have legislators being elected into office based on their particular interpretation of Christianity, and they've been legislating that. And so, as we can see now, here we are arguing about basic rights of a woman's right to determine whether she wants to carry her baby or not, her abortion right, her right to do what she wants with her body in this regard, right? In matter of health. And here we have legislators and the
Mm-hmm.
courts deciding what women can and cannot do. And this, for me, I connect it with how Christianity is being interpreted in a particular way that is misogynistic at heart.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a lot of correlation between these misogynistic types of people, but there's also a lot of connection between the egalitarian types of people all over the world. So I don't want to, we always highlight so much on the negative stuff in the media, but there's actually a
Sure.
lot of good stuff that's happening
That's
in
right.
communities.
So I'm going to ask you back about, you were raised in a family where your dad's job was as a diplomat. You feel less diplomat to me and more prophetic. Do you ever feel like you're in a slightly different role than the diplomat? How do you think about that?
Yeah, no, definitely. I am not very diplomatic, actually. That is very good call, Doug. That's because you know my activist side. But I do know how to sit and speak to diplomats and government officials. I know how to carry myself that way. And I know when they're answering when they're not answering an answer, for example,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I know they're just beating around the bush and not really giving you, I can recognize that. Um, yeah, and especially in the global South, America is a lot more direct in our speech, and the Northern Europeans especially, but in the rest of the world, they do speak in nuances, and so I've had to kind of uh, brush on my diplomatic skills in order to really listen to what they're saying. So so
Mm-hmm.
I've lost touch with that a little bit, but yes, it is true. I'm not very diplomatic.
Well, I think you are actually quite. I mean, I think you're quite skilled at that. It just seems like your call is more the work of a prophet, to call into being what should be. And diplomats, I know they have other duties that are really important, but this role of saying there's a kind of world that we can imagine, a kind of world that we ought to live in, and we should be living in that world. That's a prophetic role.
Yes, and thank you for that. And I feel that I'm in a very unique position, given my upbringing and my skill set and my communication skills, and how I've been able to really um, uh, simplify a lot of these very complicated legal matters, philosophical matters, whether it be religion or philosophies of life, the issue of ethics in religion and the issue of ethics in human rights, and how these are all issues that are intertwined with each other, and how do you utilize all these skill sets and languages to better humankind. And 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 the best way is, with diplomats, a lot of them are they're not experts in human rights. They're not experts in the issues that I'm addressing. So I actually have to educate them. And so I have to educate diplomats at that level. I have to educate policymakers. I have to educate funders. I have to re-educate members of the Muslim population at large. I have to educate the children who are illiterate in some of the countries that I work in. So, and the women folk, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all these different levels of education, teaching that I have to do.
Yeah.
And I actually really love doing it. But the most important thing, the most effective way to touch people is to actually understand what their needs are, what their agenda is, and then to address it in that framing.
Hmm.
As long as it correlates, and as long as you exchange ideas, as long as you learn from each other, et cetera, right? So this is very important. So I'll give you a really good example. So I'm in this very small I'm in Burundi, and I have a fantastic partner that I work with, an imam that I work with, and now we have like 958 imams in our network that are promoting women and girls' rights and human rights in general. So we went from 0 to 958 in 5 years.
Wow.
In Burundi, DRC, and Rwanda. Now we're expanding to to Uganda, Tanzania, and hopefully Nigeria. And so this imam invited me to come and speak, and so you have about 75 mothers at this mosque. They're all sitting down on the floor, and we're to address female genital mutilation and child marriage, all these gender issues. And so I'm speaking to the mothers, and I says, okay, look, if you marry off your daughter at a young age, what are you going to get? You're going to get the dowry or the meher. This is something that the bride is supposed to receive. But what has happened is that the parents take the money. And so I said to the mothers, first of all, that is forbidden in Islam, because that gift of marriage, is supposed to go from the groom to the bride, not to you, the parents. So that's sin number one. And then sin number two is the girl deserves education. That is their right as well. And then the thing is, let's talk about your rights. Now, if you're going to marry off your daughter, you're going to take this money that you're not supposed to be taking. What, 200 euros? That's nothing, right? It's going to last you maybe a year or two. But if you educate your daughter, she is going to support you for the rest of your life. What's better?
Mm-hmm.
And they all smiled, right? And so this is sort of some of the, sad to say, I think people at some level are selfish.
Yeah.
And so how do you use that to your own advantage? So that's something I've learned.
So talk about this meeting that you were just in earlier this morning. You're part of an advisory group to the United Nations. Can you explain all that? A lot of us won't know how the United Nations is organized, or that they have advisory groups and all the rest. So if you're willing to give us a little education on how the UN functions and what your role is and what you were up to today.
Yeah, so there's something called the Multi-Faith Advisory Council, from which I'm a member of, and then that council basically advises the all of the UN agencies on matters of human rights, climate, gender issues, whatever it is that UN agencies are doing. So, for example, if it's if it's UN Women, how can UN Women partner, and how do we advise UN Women in an advisor capacity, and how to use faith languages in a women's rights affirming manner? So that would be one way. So we're talking. So I've been working with partner with UN Women for many years, and so they have a lot of programming and missions, and you have the Sustainable Development Goals that United Nations in agreement and signed on by all the member countries, 198 countries. There are benchmarks to be met by 2030, which is simply 8 years away, which is very short for all that needs to be achieved still, which I don't think we're going to achieve. And so the Multi-Faith Advisory Council does that. Basically, how do we advise UN agencies in matters of human rights or humanitarian advice, et cetera, et cetera. And we also, from that, there is a gender working group, which I co-chair. And this is specifically on women and girls' rights issues, on gender issues. And so this morning we were discussing about how faith organizations need to be more mindful of gender issues, because particularly traditional ones that are on the Faith Advisory Council, they're very patriarchal. And so there is tension within this advisory council between the more patriarchy institutions and the more women-led, such as MPV and the YMCA, and so on. So or the Reform Judaism, so there's tension when it comes to gender issues, because we're talking about abortion rights, whereas they won't even address that issue, right? So our meetings, we have monthly meetings on the gender working group on how to advance this issue of gender, and how some patriarchal organizations use gender issues to secure funding for themselves, but do not include women in the process of the implementation, do not include women in the process of planning. They'll just borrow our ideas, for example, and they utilize it and they run with it, and not benefit the women that they're supposed to be, supporting and advancing causes for, right? So these are some of the internal discussions that we have, and how can we advance this at all the UN agencies, and how do we move forward? So that's a bit of a snippet. And to be a member of the Multi-Faith Advisory Council, you have to have ECOSOC status, which is a UN process. You have to prove that you subscribe to all of the UN principles in Declaration of Human Rights.
Well, good work, and it's so important. A lot of people believe that when you're a small organization, which you all are on the scale of organizations, right, and kind of having to fund yourself and put all this together, that the best thing to do is to focus on one thing in one place and have tangible, movable goals. I can see by your facial expression, which people on the podcast won't have the hint. You see that a little differently.
Oh my God, my board members have been saying this to me from day one. It's like, you can't do all this, honey. Just pick three things, for God's sake,
Yeah.
And I can't, because everything is so intersectional. And I've been, we use intersectional from day one. It's not for us. It's like, yeah, of course we're all intersectional. I don't have just one identity, and you don't, and nobody does. And so it's really so for me, being intersectional in the work is what it is, and I can't untangle that, because the world is complex, human beings is complex, we're all interrelated. When you talk about climate change, you're talking how people are migrating already because of climate change, and how that's impacting the Europeans, for example, and how that is impacting their policies, and how it's raising and flaming the alt-right. I mean, it's like everything is intersectional. And so it's impossible for me to do that in a nutshell. It's just impossible. It drains me, but the problems that I have by being intersectional is that funders are not intersectional. Funders are very siloed. Governments are very siloed in their works, and now you're starting to see some cross elements. Because, so for example, we've been talking, I'll give you a perfect example that your audience can wrap their head around when I talk about intersectionality. So MPV is part of the umbrella organization of against child forced marriages. For the longest time, it's seen as if like child forced marriage only happens to straight girls. But it doesn't. It happens to lesbian young women as well. And if so, even more so, because in the traditional, which tends to happen in traditional families, is that if you are gay, then you are forced into marriage to straighten you out, right? And so when I address child forced marriage, I address it from an intersectional issue, like the example that I gave you. That's just one simple example.
Yeah, and so you really have to be and are conversant in the myriad issues that link all of this together.
And so I read a lot. I read, foreign policy, which I've been reading since I was 11 years old. But I read, all kinds
the
of
child of a diplomat, the curse of the child of a diplomat, right? That you're reading foreign relation reports. Or you just like that kind of stuff? Is that right? You just like it, or was it just goes around
I love
the
that
house?
kind of stuff. I always did, and I did it at my own will.
Yeah.
I had there was a magazine called the Far Eastern Economic Review, which doesn't exist anymore, and I had a dictionary on one side because there were a lot of words that I didn't understand. So I was always referring to the dictionary, and it's funny how now I'm also a permanent member of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is very policy and think tank. So.
Okay, so I just want to comment on you for a minute. Like you have this range that goes from, as a child, reading the Far East Economic Review and or Economic Review. You like policy. You have to function at a diplomatic level, but you're also thinking, what we need to do is have music that American Muslims can sing in their places, and we should restructure the way a mosque is organized and have it be more egalitarian. And we should probably work on a different logo that really set, like, you're spanning this kind of range, and I like people like that. I think it's a really important cross-disciplined approach to the world. Assuming all that's accurate, and feel free to say if I got that any of that not quite right. When you think about success, or is it working? How do you measure that? How are you measuring? Or do you not play the success game? Or how do you deal with that question?
Well, for a long time, for many years, I didn't know if anyone was even paying attention or listening, right? But for me, the success is actually measurable. When you look at the Pew Research, for example, one of the questions that they ask is, do you think the Quran should be interpreted for the 21st century? That was actually our tagline on our website, and Islam for the 21st century, right? So, and they showed, it was evident that American Muslims, over like 52% of American Muslims believe that Islam should be interpreted for the 21st century. When I look at, so many organizations have borrowed our principles, have borrowed from our the way we practice and the way we frame the human rights context in Islam, and how they've used it in their own organizations. There's a whole proliferation of Muslim organizations that have been doing that. The fact that I lead men and women prayer, and we've been doing this without much fanfare, just a community thing that we do. We don't need the media there. We've been doing it since 2006, and now you have so many other women also doing the same in Europe. For example, Canada, it's a given, but also in Europe, that's started to take root in the last 7 to 8 years. And so we see the impact of our work. And what's really nice about these European women is that when they start their mosque, when they launch their mosque, they've invited me to do the call for prayer, to participate in the first service, which is very sweet of them. And so and so there is, so we're all connected because we are all doing. The work that we're doing is really pushing the envelope at our own local level. Yeah, this is very important, at our own local level. What I'm doing in the United States is very different than what I'm doing and advocating for in Africa. Very different. And so the most important thing is not to impose your values, but to have people buy into the values themselves, because that's sustainable, because then the fire in their belly will be lit, and then they will carry the work.
We, around our world, we refer to people who do that work, and when we do it, we call it the gift of going first. Like, if you write the first expression or you lead out in an action, then just a lot of people who don't want to go first, or didn't really know how they would do it, or it's just so much easier to repeat something someone's done, or to share it, or to copy it, or to feel encouraged by it.
And there's strength in a collection of voices, right? So that I'm also a founder of a global umbrella organization called Alliance of Inclusive Muslims, and this is basically taking a lot of what we've done in the context of human rights to the international level, because, like I said, there's been a proliferation of scholars of Islam and human rights defenders of Muslim cultures and faith leaders and women's rights organizations that want to partner with MPV. But because we're an American organization, I thought, well, it's better for us to create an umbrella organization where we are all equal, one organization, one vote. And this is a collective, I think of about 48 organizations now. And now we have, some powerful religious leaders in our network as well. And so, so that's the evidence of the success, right?
Well, in a minute, I want you to talk about how people can be involved here, and if you have things around the country that are ways or chapters for people to be involved in. I also want to ask you about, in the American context, we're 365 days now into the Biden administration. I think the Trump administration was a real serious disaster and harm to the well-being of the planet and everyone who lives on it. I think it was 4 years that made the world less good. And so I'm really glad that that's over.
You're so kind. Less good.
And but we're 1 year now into the Biden administration, and you've cared a lot about the intersection of culture and politics and faith in the United States. What are your thoughts so far on the Biden administration? Are there things you really want to point at and note? Are there things you really want to be different? Are you involved with the White House at all? Anything around that?
I'm not involved directly with the White House. I mean, they have the gender policy. I forget what it's called, but so I pay attention to what they're doing or what they want to do. So the one disappointment is that when Biden was campaigning, he was campaigning for the confirmation or the registration of the 38th straight state of the ERA, the Equality Rights Amendment, that would actually put into the Constitution that Americans cannot be discriminated based on gender and sex, right? I mean, it should be such an easy amendment, but apparently not. So, and he hasn't really been forward on that. He hasn't really taken the initiative of that. And so we are really, as part of the ERA coalition nationally, we are working towards really getting the ERA not just passed at the local level, local states, and many states have already passed it, but it's just a matter of the Department of Justice registering it. And once that's registered, then we can actually have that amendment. So that's kind of like the one failure of the Biden administration in this regard. But I think on most aspects, I think he's doing a really good job. And I think people are giving him a really unfair report card, given the Senate situation that we have. And then people are talking about how the midterms is going to go Republican. And I'm an immigrant to the United States. I don't get it. I don't get Americans. I mean, what the heck? Seriously?
Right.
You're going to vote for a party and policies that is actually going to curtail and take us backwards when we're desperately trying to move forward and to provide and to advance the American society on so many different levels, including, child benefits. It's just mind-boggling. I don't get the American voters.
Yeah, boy, when you just think about this like you would having a friend that's in a dating relationship, and you say, and you're going back to that person again, like you just broke up with them for a really good reason, and now you just can't quit them. And all
Not
the
only
people
that,
that
this
can't
friend
quit
who
these
bashed you
Republicans.
up, wife beating, I mean, just violent.
Amazing. It's amazing to me too.
Right.
I know I'm trying really hard to understand it and to get it, because, to change, to try to ask someone to change without first understanding who and how they live in the world, who they are and how they live in the world, is a different project. And I think sometimes it borderlines on being sort of manipulative and cruel. So you kind of got to understand it, but it's really hard to get, like, why in the world?
I think, the example that I gave to you about my talk to the mothers in Burundi about, if you were going to educate your daughter, she's going to support you for the rest of your life. I think that selfish element of marketing and messaging is what the Democrats need to really be doing. Like, really go at the individual level of selfishness. Like, this is what you get if you vote for us, in this very simplistic terms. And I think that's the kind of messaging that's not really getting out there clear enough.
Yeah.
And hopefully
Well,
they'll
for
get on
sure.
it between now and elections.
Yeah. If they believe that's how they should do it, they're sure not communicating well. It's rather befuddling sometimes. All right. So Peggy Hay has asked, what's the nature of your organization? She lives near Dearborn, Michigan, and she's wondering that there's a large Islamic community there in Dearborn, as you might know. I think Somali community there. And do you have any kind of things or ways for people who live in Dearborn, Michigan, or elsewhere to be involved in
No.
what you do?
Sorry, we don't have a chapter in Michigan. I think the best thing for you to do is just to go to mpvusa.org, which is our the website, and to sign up to our newsletter. And there may be some activities there that you can join when we announce it. We also have a calendar. A lot of things are virtual right now too. But nothing specific to the Dearborn, Michigan area anyway. Yeah.
And MPV USA, so Muslims for Progressive Values USA, United States. .org.
Yeah.
That website, it's going to have, it doesn't have chapters to be involved in. There's other materials there and resources and helps and some of the rest, right?
And we do have chapters, but just not in Michigan. We have,
San
Francisco, DC, Boston, New York, Florida, and Chicago and LA. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What goes into starting a chapter in a place like that? Like what do you need an organizer there, or is it what set of conditions have to be right?
The criteria. Well, usually we get people coming, and I'll interview them to see where their heart is at and where their mind and willingness is at, and the capacity to do it. And then I encourage them to have a team of at least a minimum of 2 to 5 to start it. And basically, we start out with a Facebook group first. Basically, it's easy, or a meetup.com page to get people to join the group, and then to organize from there.
Do people who want to do that or reach out to you, are they typically wanting to organize around a particular issue? Are they organizing around the desire for a community, for their progressive identity? Yeah. Community. So they're not necessarily yet wanting to engage in a particular action or set of work. It tends to be people who feel like you did, like you want a community around you, and this is hard to do alone. And
yes and no, but a lot of Muslims, progressive Muslims, are already politically active in social justice, issues, or whatever issues, animal rights issues, whatever the issue is. They're already very progressive, and they're already involved by way of the institutions that are much more advanced in organizing than MPV is. For example, right? The ACLU, for example, they're just off the chart in that regard. And so a lot of those Muslims that are coming to us that want to organize a community, they are doing so because they have these progressive values and on issues of myriad issues that they're progressive on, but they're spiritually disconnected from it. And so they want to find like-minded Muslims, a community that also share the same set of social justice issues and human rights issues to be with. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Are you hopeful in this new year that we're in? Do you think about the years like this, or do you feel like there's some good things coming forward? And how are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm feeling good. Every year is a good year. Yeah. I mean, it's what you make of it.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, Ani, you're such a common gooder, and we love the common do-gooders.
I am a common gooder. Yeah. I love that.
So thank you for all of your good work for Muslims for Progressive Values, for your spirit and leadership, and your willingness to say yes to so many things. Just really, really great.
Thank you, Doug. And thanks for all the work that you've been doing as well.
Sure,
we would not have a Biden if it wasn't for you.
Boy, I hope that's not true. But we're glad to do our part. We are glad to do our part. Hey, friends, we'll see you all tomorrow. Thanks for being with us today. And thank you, Ani. And Dan, anything else from you?
Nope, I think we're good.
All right. Okay. Hey, thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Peggy. Thank you, Russian Bot, and others who were commenting on the live stream today. Appreciate it. Okay. I'll see